3 months after the military reported my husband dead. I still slept with the hallway light on. Then my sister zoomed in on a blurry drone video from New Mexico. The man sitting outside that desert facility had Noah's exact eyebrow scar and wedding ring, yet the true shock was not that he was alive. It was realizing someone had monetized his death, and the very first name on that list belonged to his own family. My name is Ashley Montrose. I am 35 years old, and until 3 months ago, my life in Alexandria, Virginia, was an exercise in controlled perfection. As the Director of Crisis Communications for Blackmere Strategic, a high-tier private security consulting firm, my daily existence revolved around mitigating disasters. I spent my days spinning narratives, burying uncomfortable truths for corporate clients, and constructing airtight alibis for situations that went sideways. I knew exactly how a clean story was built. I knew the architecture of a perfect tragedy, but nothing could have prepared me for the flawless, sterile narrative that was delivered to my own front door on a humid Tuesday evening. 2 officers in immaculate dress uniforms stood on my porch under the harsh yellow glow of the porch light. The air was thick and heavy, yet a sudden violent cold seized my bones the second I saw their faces. They did not have to speak. I already knew the choreography of this moment. Their delivery was flawlessly rehearsed, slipping from their lips like a well-worn script. They offered standard condolences, their voices modulated to the exact, careful pitch of sympathetic professionalism. Noah Montrose, my husband, the man who had kissed my forehead exactly 14 days ago, was gone. They told me it was a classified military operation overseas. They called it a catastrophic failure. When the initial shock receded enough for me to force air into my lungs, I demanded to know where it happened. They respectfully cited sealed files and national security. When I demanded to see him, to bring him home so I could touch his face one last time. The older officer shifted his weight. His eyes locked onto a space just above my left shoulder, and he delivered a line that would echo in my head for weeks. "Ma'am, the condition of the remains makes identification impossible. We are so very sorry." The door closed, leaving me alone in the hallway. The silence in the house was absolute and deafening. I stood frozen, my eyes drifting to the wooden hook by the entryway. Noah's olive green canvas jacket was still hanging there. The left pocket was slightly sagging, holding the heavy weight of his spare truck keys just like it always did. I walked into the kitchen like a ghost haunting my own life. The dishwasher was half full. The white ceramic mug he used for his dark roast coffee on the morning of his deployment was sitting perfectly on the top rack, a faint brown ring still visible at the bottom. The house was entirely unchanged. The world had not stopped turning. The walls had not collapsed. Everything was exactly as it had been 24 hours ago, except that exactly one human being had been subtracted from the equation. The sheer normalcy of the room felt like a cruel joke. The memorial service happened with terrifying, relentless efficiency. It was a blur of polished brass, crisp salutes, and a painfully light, completely closed mahogany casket. A beautifully folded American flag was pressed into my trembling hands by a man whose face I could not even focus on. Men in dark suits and pristine military uniforms stepped up to the podium and gave soaring speeches about ultimate sacrifice, brotherhood, and unwavering duty. I sat in the front row, wrapped in black silk, nodding when appropriate, but beneath the numbness, a persistent freezing hollow feeling gnawed at the lining of my stomach. Something was wrong. Everything was happening too fast. It was too clean. In my line of work, I knew that death, especially violent death in a chaotic war zone, is inherently messy. There are delays, there are conflicting reports, there are loose ends. This felt like a stage play where the stagehands were rushing to strike the set before the audience could realize the props were fake. A few days later, a solemn military liaison officer visited the house and handed me a heavy sealed plastic bag containing Noah's personal effects. I waited until I was completely alone before I sat on the living room floor, my hands shaking violently as I broke the plastic seal. The smell of desert dust, dried sweat, and metallic copper wafted up, hitting me so hard I gagged. I poured the contents onto the rug. My blood ran cold as I sifted through the items. There was a scratched dog tag, so battered and burned it was practically unreadable. Beside it lay a heavy tactical watch with a cracked nylon strap. Noah never wore nylon straps. He hated how the fabric chafed against his skin when he sweat. He strictly preferred heavy silicone bands. I pushed the watch aside and dug deeper into the pile. At the bottom corner of the bag, my fingers brushed against a cheap, tarnished metal ring. It was lightweight and ugly. Noah only ever wore the matte black titanium wedding band I had given him, a ring he swore he never took off. I stared at the metal circle on my carpet. It felt as if someone had hurriedly scooped up the detritus of a stranger's life from the dirt and shoved it into a bag with my husband's name printed on the label. I had barely processed the bizarre belongings when Kent Montrose, Noah's older brother, inserted himself into my daily survival routine. He practically moved into my house during those first few agonizing weeks. His concern was suffocating. He poured my coffee, answered my ringing phone, and intercepted the endless stream of well-wishers holding casseroles. But beneath his sympathetic smiles, his grief felt sharp, almost impatient. "Ashley, you need to finalize the survivor benefits." Kent told me on a rainy Thursday afternoon. He was standing at the kitchen island, tapping a thick, neatly organized stack of paperwork. "And we should look into transferring the deed for the Tennessee cabin. It is what Noah would have wanted. You need a clean break to heal. Do not torture yourself with questions anymore. It will only destroy you." His eyes were wide, playing the part of the protective older brother perfectly, but I noticed his hands were completely steady as he held out a silver pen for me to sign, away the mountain getaway Noah loved more than anything. Before I could argue with Kent, Marissa Cade swept into the picture. Marissa was my oldest friend, a sharp, relentless lawyer who built a lucrative career handling benefits and legal claims for military families. She arrived at my door with bags of expensive takeout food and a massive binder full of color-coded tabs. "Let me take this heavy lifting off your plate, Ash," she said softly, sitting next to me on the sofa. Her voice dripped with practiced empathy, the same tone she used to win over grieving widows in conference rooms. "I will handle the insurance, the death benefits, the whole bureaucratic nightmare. Pro bono, of course. You just focus on breathing and getting out of bed every day." I handed her the forms because I was simply too exhausted to read the fine print. The grief was a physical weight, pinning me to the floor. I trusted Marissa. We had known each other for 15 years. She was my anchor in a storm I could not navigate. On the first night after the memorial, the silence of the master bedroom became an unbearable physical presence. I crawled into bed, curled into Noah's side of the mattress, and clutched his pillow to my chest, desperate to catch a lingering scent of his cologne. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and opened my saved voicemails. I needed to hear his voice, even if I knew the sound of it would break me entirely. I tapped the final message he had left me, recorded just hours before he went dark on his last deployment. The audio hissed with heavy static, but his deep, calm voice cut through the noise. "Hey, babe. Just checking in before we lose comms for a while. Look, things here are messy right now. The logistics are all over the place. If they tell you something and it sounds too neat, do not buy it right away. I love you so much. I will see you on the other side." The recording clicked off. The room plunged back into suffocating silence. If they tell you something and it sounds too neat, do not buy it right away. The phrase wrapped around my throat like a wire. My mind raced through the disjointed puzzle pieces. The wrong watch in the plastic bag. The rushed funeral. The conveniently sealed casket. Kent aggressively pushing the cabin deed transfer. Marissa eagerly sweeping away the complicated paperwork. Every single aspect of my husband's death had been handled, processed, and filed away with terrifying speed. But the grief was a monstrous, physical weight crushing my chest. To actually listen to Noah's warning meant stepping off a cliff into a terrifying void of paranoia. It meant acknowledging that the people closest to me might be lying. In the suffocating darkness of that bedroom, it was simply easier to believe my husband was dead. Believing he was dead meant I could mourn him and eventually heal. Believing anything else meant I had to fight a war I did not understand, against shadows I could not see. So, I closed my eyes, squeezed the phone until my knuckles ached, and desperately forced myself to believe the perfect, agonizing lie. 3 weeks bled into one another. I learned quickly that becoming a widow is less about a single shattering moment and more about a brutal, unending series of tiny subtractions. I ate dry toast over the kitchen sink at odd hours. I slept in fractured, 2-hour intervals, usually on the living room sofa because our bed felt like a massive, empty ocean. I carefully navigated my own home to avoid the spaces that held his heaviest footprints. I did not open the garage where his tools sat perfectly aligned on the pegboard. I kept the blinds drawn on the back patio where we used to drink wine on Friday nights. Yet, for all my avoidance, my thumb hovered over his name in my phone contacts every single night. Noah Mobile. I stared at the glowing letters until my vision blurred, but I could never summon the courage to press delete. Erasing his name felt like committing a murder myself. The administrative machinery of death was supposed to keep me distracted, but it only bred a quiet, creeping unease. Marissa had assured me 2 weeks prior that the survivor benefits and military life insurance payouts were essentially a done deal. She claimed the bureaucracy was just turning its slow wheels. But my bank accounts remained entirely stagnant. The deposits were nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Kent was exhibiting the exact opposite of bureaucratic lethargy. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, displaying another message from my brother-in-law. It was his 4th message in 5 days, asking when I planned to list the Tennessee property. He called it a necessary step for my emotional closure. He said holding on to a remote mountain cabin would only anchor me to the past. It felt intensely suffocating. The money I actually needed to survive was inexplicably delayed, while the asset Noah treasured most was being aggressively pushed toward the auction block. The first tangible fracture in their carefully constructed reality arrived at 3 a.m. via a sterile, automated email. I was sitting in the dark, scrolling mindlessly through my inbox, when a security alert popped up from a cloud storage provider. It notified me of an unrecognized login attempt on Noah's encrypted drive. The notification made my breath catch in my throat. Noah was meticulous about digital security. The initial seed password for that specific directory was a bizarre string of characters only I knew. Combining our first apartment number and the name of my childhood street, I scrambled to grab my laptop, my hands trembling as I typed in the recovery credentials. The dashboard loaded, bathing my face in harsh blue light. I clicked into the activity log, my eyes scanning the timestamps. A sharp jolt of adrenaline hit my system. Someone had successfully bypassed the secondary firewall. But the truly terrifying detail was not the breach itself. It was the date of the action. A massive, heavily encrypted folder labeled Logistics had been permanently deleted. The timestamp on the deletion was exactly 4 days after the military officers stood on my porch and told me my husband was dead. My blood turned to ice. Ghosts do not log into cloud servers. Dead men do not clean up their digital footprints. Someone else had been inside his files, scrubbing information days after his heart supposedly stopped beating. I needed an anchor. Someone to tell me I was not losing my mind. I called Marissa the next morning, my voice tight and ragged as I explained the deleted folder and the timestamps. I expected my sharp, fiercely protective friend to immediately shift into legal combat mode. Instead, I was met with a heavy, patronizing sigh. "Ashley, please do not do this to yourself," Marissa said, her tone dripping with pity. "Do not become obsessed with the technology. I see this all the time with grieving spouses. You are looking for a plot because a conspiracy is easier to accept than a random, senseless tragedy. It was probably just an automated server purge or a delayed sync from his field laptop. Let it go." A hot flush of shame burned my cheeks, but it was instantly swallowed by a deep, visceral spike of irritation. I knew what a server purge looked like. I worked in crisis management. I knew the difference between an automated system cleanup and a deliberate, targeted deletion. Marissa treating me like a hysterical, grieving housewife felt like a slap to the face. That same afternoon, Black Mirror Strategic called me into the office. The meeting was brief, overly polite, and entirely non-negotiable. The senior partners expressed their deepest sympathies and then firmly suggested an indefinite leave of absence. They claimed I needed time to heal, but I could read the subtext. A crisis manager cannot function effectively if her own life is a volatile crisis. I was handed cardboard boxes and asked to clear my desk. As I packed away my framed degrees and client folders, my fingers brushed against a heavy tungsten pen Noah had bought me for my promotion. The cold metal triggered a sudden, vivid memory. It was late at night, maybe 2 months before his final deployment. He was standing in our kitchen, rubbing his temples, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. He made me promise not to repeat what he was about to say. He told me he had been auditing the shipping manifests for his unit. "They are tagging the crates with the wrong cargo codes." "Ash," he had whispered, his eyes darting toward the window as if someone was listening. "They are logging standard tactical medical supplies, but the weight ratios are entirely wrong. Someone is moving high-level surveillance hardware using our medical runs as a blind." At the time, I had dismissed it as operational stress. Now, staring at the empty cardboard box in my office, the memory felt like a physical blow. Mislabeled cargo codes, a deleted logistics folder, a sealed casket. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently pleading with myself to stop. I told myself I was just piecing together meaningless fragments, desperately building a house of cards because the reality of an empty bed was too agonizing to bear. I am just a broken widow, I thought, but the universe refused to let me play the victim. When I arrived home, a courier package was waiting on my front porch. The return address belonged to Kent. I ripped open the thick cardboard envelope. Inside was a complete set of property transfer documents for the Tennessee cabin. Kent had not just sent me forms to review, he had completely filled them out. He had secured a notary seal on his end. The only thing missing was my signature on a little yellow sticky flag. He had even included a prepaid overnight return envelope. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the perfectly typed legal documents. The pressure suddenly felt physical, like hands pressing down on my shoulders. The in-laws rushing the estate, the lawyer stalling the insurance money, the unseen hands scrubbing his digital files. It was an orchestrated campaign. They were trying to close the book on Noah Montrose. They wanted the cover slammed shut, the spine glued down, and the story buried deep underground, quickly, cleanly, and without a single question asked. They thought I was too crushed by grief to notice the seams tearing in their perfect narrative. They were wrong. I walked into the home office. I bypassed the tissues and the sympathy cards stacked on the desk. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a fresh, unlined black notebook. I grabbed the tungsten pen Noah gave me. I opened to the first blank page. I wrote down the date of his supposed death. I wrote down the exact time the officers arrived. I wrote the word Marissa next to the missing insurance money. I wrote the word Kent next to the rushed cabin transfer. I logged the precise timestamp of the deleted cloud folder. I wrote the phrase mislabeled cargo codes and underlined it twice. I sat back and looked at the page. It was no longer a collection of paranoid thoughts. It was a timeline. It was evidence. This was the very first small, deliberate action of a woman who did not yet realize she was stepping onto the battlefield of a massive, unforgiving war. I closed the notebook. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but the paralyzing numbness was gone. It had been entirely replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. Exactly 3 months after the men in uniform stood on my front porch and destroyed my reality. My phone shattered the dead silence of my living room. It was exactly 10 in the morning on a random Tuesday. The caller identification flashed the name of my younger sister, Sienna Blake. Sienna was a fiercely talented freelance video editor whose sleeping schedule was permanently inverted due to her demanding late-night client deadlines. She never called anyone before noon unless someone was bleeding or in the back of a police cruiser. "Ashley," she breathed into the receiver the second I answered. Her voice was shaking so violently I could actually hear her teeth chattering against the plastic of her phone. "You need to get to my apartment, right now." "Sienna, what is wrong?" "Are you hurt?" I asked, my heart instantly accelerating. "Just get here, please. Do not ask me any questions over the phone. Just drive." The line went completely dead. The drive from my suburban house to her downtown industrial loft was supposed to take exactly 15 minutes. That morning, it felt like an agonizing hour. Every single intersection became a battleground of anxiety. The traffic lights bled a harsh, unforgiving red against the overcast sky, forcing me to sit idling while my mind raced through 100 different catastrophic scenarios. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with such force that my knuckles turned a stark, sickly white. I bypassed the intercom, used my spare key, and burst through her heavy metal front door without knocking. Sienna was sitting rigid at her massive editing workstation, surrounded by the glowing ambient light of 3 large, high-definition monitors. She looked incredibly pale, her dark eyes wide and heavily bloodshot, as if she had not slept in days. She did not say a word of greeting. She simply pointed a trembling, ink-stained finger at the center screen. "Sit down," she commanded softly, her voice tight. I pulled up a metal stool beside her. Displayed on the center monitor was a sweeping, incredibly sharp drone video. The landscape was unmistakable. It was the harsh, sun-baked, unforgiving desert of New Mexico. Endless stretches of dry scrub brush, rich red dirt, and a sprawling, isolated compound surrounded by impossibly high security walls filled the frame. "I was pulling some environmental reference footage for a corporate real estate client," Sienna explained, her hands flying across her mechanical keyboard with practiced speed. "This clip was uploaded to a commercial broker's site. It was supposed to be a standard, boring property flyover. Just watch." She hit the space bar. The drone glided smoothly over the desert terrain, panning downward toward a large, adobe-style building featuring a wide, wraparound wooden porch. The camera swept past a deeply shaded area. "Wait for it," Sienna whispered. She grabbed her editing dial, scrubbing the timeline backward and slowing the playback to a fraction of its normal speed. "Right here. Pay attention to the bottom left. This specific frame lasts for less than 2 seconds." She hit pause. The image froze dead on the screen. She grabbed her mouse and rapidly drew a digital cropping box around the bottom left corner of the screen, right at the edge of the shaded wooden porch. She maximized that specific quadrant. The pixels expanded, blurring into heavy, blocky squares for a fraction of a second before her high-end enhancement software aggressively sharpened the edges. Sitting in a heavy wooden chair, completely oblivious to the camera above, was a man. He was drastically thinner than I remembered, his collarbones jutting sharply against a plain gray shirt. A thick, unkempt brown beard covered his jawline, completely altering the shape of his face. His left arm was tightly bound in a dark, heavy medical sling. But as the image clarified, the breath was violently, physically punched out of my lungs. The ambient temperature in Sienna's loft seemed to plummet instantly. A heavy bucket of crushed ice washed directly over my spine, freezing my blood in my veins. I could not speak. I could not cry. I could not even force my chest to rise and fall. I could only stare at the glowing monitor. The man was angled slightly outward, facing the harsh desert sun. The natural lighting caught the right side of his face perfectly. There, slicing diagonally through his right eyebrow, was a jagged, crescent-shaped scar. It was the exact scar Noah received from a surfing accident on the 4th day of our honeymoon in Costa Rica. His left hand was resting limply on the armrest of the wooden chair. A stark, matte black titanium band sat heavily on his ring finger, the exact ring I had placed there 5 years ago. "Sienna," I choked out, the single word tearing at the lining of my throat like shattered glass. "I know," she whispered, a tear finally breaking free and spilling over her cheek. The video was completely pulled down from the internet less than half an hour after it went live. The broker deleted the entire listing without a trace, but I had already cached the raw video file. I downloaded it immediately because the man sitting on that porch looked way too terrifyingly familiar to me. I reached out and pressed my fingertips against the cold glass of the monitor. The screen offered no warmth, but the truth was undeniable. It was him. Beneath the severe weight loss, beneath the unfamiliar beard and the hollowed-out, exhausted cheeks, it was the man I had buried an empty, heavily sealed casket for. My husband was not a pile of unrecognizable ash scattered across a foreign war zone. He was sitting on a porch in the American Southwest. "Look at this over here," Sienna said, shifting my desperate focus to the right monitor. She had isolated another frame from earlier in the video, right when the drone passed over the main entrance gate. She applied a heavy contrast filter and zoomed in heavily on a wrought iron sign arching proudly over the dusty driveway. The metal letters spelled out, "Crestfall Recovery Ranch." "It is a private, extreme high-security rehabilitation center," Sienna explained, pulling up a deeply buried tax document on her third screen. "There is absolutely no public website, no patient testimonials. It is completely off the grid. The property is registered as a limited liability company under a massive, tangled web of corporate shell accounts. It is the perfect, impenetrable cover to hide a human being from the rest of the world." My physical paralysis shattered. It was replaced instantly by a frantic, burning, acidic need for immediate action. I pulled my phone from my pocket and frantically searched the facility name. I dug through pages of search results until I found a single, unlisted local phone number buried deep within a regional zoning permit from 2 years ago. I dialed it, pressing the speaker tightly to my ear. The line rang exactly 3 times before a sterile, highly automated voice answered. "You have reached the administrative office. We are unable to take your call. Please leave a message." I hung up and dialed again. I got the exact same automated voice. I scoured the internet for an administrative email address, eventually finding a generic contact form on an outdated local contractor registry. I typed out a frantic, aggressive message. I explicitly stated my name, claimed I had visual photographic proof my husband was currently on their premises, and threatened to bring federal law enforcement to their front gates if they did not respond immediately. I hit send. 10 minutes later, I received an automated mail delivery failure notification. The address had not just bounced my message. They had actively blacklisted my domain the moment the system processed my name in the subject line. I spent the next 2 solid hours calling every local hospital, every sheriff's department, and every emergency clinic within a 50-mile radius of the geographic coordinates Sienna had pulled from the video metadata. Every single official I spoke to gave me the exact same rehearsed, aggressively bored answers. They had never heard of Crestfall. They had absolutely no record of a John Doe matching Noah's physical description. The facility was located on private land, completely out of their legal jurisdiction, and they could not help me. The more they stonewalled me, the more the absolute silence deafened me. The aggressive lack of information was not a dead end. It was a massive, flashing neon sign pointing directly to the truth. If this was simply a bizarre mistake, if that thin man was just a random stranger who happened to share a unique facial scar and a specific wedding band, someone would have answered the phone and told me I was crazy. Instead, they locked the digital doors, cut the phone lines, and threw up defensive walls. They were terrified of me. I stood up from the metal stool. The heavy, suffocating grief that had anchored me to the floor for the past 90 days evaporated into the air. I was no longer a broken widow waiting for an insurance check. I was a wife whose husband had been stolen, declared dead, and hidden away in a desert cage while his own family urged me to sell his assets. "Pack a bag," I told Sienna. My voice was completely flat, entirely stripped of all mourning and replaced with pure, hardened steel. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Are we going to call the police?" "The police told me my husband was dead," I replied coldly. "The military told me my husband was dead. We are not trusting a single person wearing a badge or a uniform." "We are going to New Mexico." "Tonight?" she asked, her hands hovering nervously over her keyboard. "Right now," I commanded. "Book the very first flight out of the airport. Get us a 4-wheel drive rental car. We are going to drive straight to those exact coordinates." I'm going to see with my own eyes if the dead man I have been weeping for is actually breathing. I turned and walked out of her loft. The air outside tasted different now. The world was no longer a tragic, random place full of senseless accidents. It was a carefully constructed, highly profitable lie, and I was about to tear it down brick by adobe brick. The flight to Albuquerque took exactly 4 hours, but the recycled air inside the cabin felt as heavy and stagnant as a sealed tomb. Sienna and I barely exchanged a single word across the 2 states. We were entirely consumed by the gravity of what we were chasing. Upon landing, we bypassed the standard sedans and secured a heavy 4-wheel drive rental vehicle, immediately pushing south on Interstate 25. The landscape rapidly shifted from urban sprawl into a scorched, desolate expanse of cracked red earth and sun-bleached rock. By the time we reached the dusty outskirts of Las Cruces, the digital thermometer on the dashboard read 104 degrees. We diverted onto a fractured, 2-lane county highway, driving for another 45 minutes until civilization entirely evaporated into the horizon. Crestfall Recovery Ranch did not look like a place of healing. It looked exactly like a black site military compound. We parked our vehicle almost a full mile down a dry dirt access road, relying on Sienna's high-powered camera lenses to survey the perimeter. Imposing 10-foot steel fences, topped with aggressive, inward-leaning razor wire, enclosed the massive property. High-resolution, motorized cameras sat mounted on reinforced metal poles at every corner, sweeping all 4 directions with mechanical precision. It was a fortress deliberately designed to keep a human being permanently locked inside, completely hidden from the rest of the world. We needed concrete leverage before risking a direct physical approach. I directed Sienna to turn the vehicle around, driving back to a dilapidated, single-story urgent care clinic we had passed 20 miles prior. Inside, the empty waiting room smelled sharply of stale iodine and cheap floor wax. I approached the laminate front desk, sliding the enhanced, printed frame from the drone video directly across the counter. I asked the young receptionist if they had treated a severe trauma patient matching this exact physical description within the last 3 months. She squinted at the paper, nodding slowly, openly confirming they had stabilized a John Doe with catastrophic shoulder and rib injuries before an immediate, unlogged transfer. But the exact second I spoke the name Noah, her posture snapped rigid. Her eyes darted frantically toward a closed office door behind her. She slid the paper back to me as if it were burning her fingers. Her voice dropped to a flat, rehearsed monotone, claiming she had misspoken and that they held no such records in their system. Before I could demand an explanation, an older nurse with deep, exhausted lines etched around her mouth brushed past me, carrying a heavy stack of medical clipboards. She deliberately avoided eye contact, but as she walked toward the side exit, she muttered under her breath for me to check the rear alley for my parked car. I told Sienna to wait inside. I walked around the sweltering brick building into the suffocating heat of the alleyway. The older nurse was standing near a rusted metal dumpster, nervously chewing her bottom lip. "You need to leave this town right now," she whispered sharply, her eyes constantly scanning the empty dirt street. That man was brought in barely breathing. We prepped him for an emergency airlift, but the standard medical evacuation was abruptly canceled. 2 black vehicles with absolutely 0 license plates pulled directly into our loading bay. Men in unmarked tactical gear flashed federal credentials, loaded him into the back, and physically confiscated every single piece of his medical charting from our internal hard drives. There are people with endless resources who want him completely erased from the system. If you keep asking questions here, you are going to disappear too. Her terrifying warning did not breed fear in my chest. Instead, it poured pure, highly combustible gasoline onto the fire that had replaced my grief. I drove us back to the hidden access road near the ranch, leaving Sienna in the driver's seat with the engine idling. I slipped through a dry, rocky ravine that provided natural cover from the elevated perimeter cameras. The sharp desert scrub brush tore viciously at my jeans, but I ignored the stinging pain. I crawled on my stomach up a steep dirt embankment until I had a clear, unobstructed line of sight through the heavy steel mesh fence. He was there. He was sitting on the exact same shaded adobe porch we had seen on the monitors in Virginia. He was staring blankly at the unforgiving desert horizon. His shoulders were severely slumped, his left arm hanging stiffly at his side, the surrounding muscles visibly atrophied. It was not a digital artifact. It was not a desperate hallucination born of blinding, crushing grief. All the air violently vanished from my lungs. The man I had loved for a decade was breathing real air. Sitting less than 50 yards away from me, I pressed my face painfully against the hot metal wire. "Noah," I choked out. The sound was barely a ragged whisper, carried forward by the dry, sweeping wind. He did not move. I swallowed the massive lump of jagged glass in my throat and forced the sound louder. "Noah!" He flinched violently. His head snapped in my direction. I expected an overwhelming wave of relief to wash over his face. I expected a tearful, desperate recognition of the woman he loved. But as his hollowed eyes locked onto my face, peering through the chain link, the expression that twisted his gaunt features was one of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked exactly like a cornered animal watching a predator approach with a drawn blade. He shot up from his heavy wooden chair, casting a frantic, paranoid glance over his shoulder toward the main glass doors of the building. He limped rapidly across the dusty courtyard, his left leg dragging slightly. He ducked behind a massive commercial air conditioning generator that perfectly shielded us both from the overhead camera sweeping that specific sector. He pressed his back against the vibrating metal casing, his chest heaving aggressively. I reached my trembling fingers through the chain links, desperate to touch his skin. But he violently recoiled, pressing himself harder against the machinery. "What are you doing here?" he rasped, his voice rough, damaged, and laced with absolute panic. "Do not let Harker know you found me. You have to leave, now." My hand froze midair, suspended in the unbearable heat. "Noah, it is me. I'm here to take you home. They came to the house. They told me you were dead." His chest continued to heave as he stared at me. His pupils were massively dilated, swimming with a thick, undeniable chemical haze. "They told me you signed for the money," he whispered frantically, his words slurring slightly at the edges as if fighting against a heavy sedative. "They showed me the bank transfers with your signature. They said you sold the cabin, took the massive payout, and agreed to let the military completely bury the operational failure. They told me you moved on." A physical wave of nausea slammed into my stomach, nearly dropping me to my knees in the dirt. He had not forgotten me. His memory was jagged, heavily fragmented, and deliberately poisoned by a constant, daily stream of heavy sedatives and psychological manipulation. They had locked him in a cage in the middle of nowhere and meticulously fed him a fabricated, horrific reality where his own wife had happily traded his life for a lucrative financial settlement. They had severed his will to escape by entirely destroying his trust in the one person who would have torn the world apart to find him. Before I could scream the absolute truth, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of gravel echoed loudly across the open yard. A white internal security vehicle with amber flashing lights rounded the far corner of the main building. Noah's eyes went impossibly wide. In a fraction of a second, his entire physical demeanor transformed. The frantic, desperate energy vanished completely. He let his shoulders droop heavily. His jaw slacked open, and he shuffled slowly out from behind the generator. He stared vacantly at his own worn shoes, perfectly playing the role of a docile, heavily medicated patient out for a permitted afternoon stroll. The armed security guard slowed the vehicle, eyeing him suspiciously through the tinted window before accelerating and driving past. I crouched low in the dirt ravine, watching my husband operate like a walking corpse inside a prison without bars. The sheer, calculating cruelty of their manipulation recalibrated the very core of my soul. I did not cry. I crawled backward down the steep embankment, sliding silently back into the sweltering heat of the rental car. Sienna took one look at my hardened face and did not ask a single question. I put the heavy vehicle in gear and drove away from the fence line. The objective had fundamentally and permanently changed. This was no longer a desperate, emotional rescue mission to find a lost husband. It was a formal declaration of absolute war. I was going to drag the rotting corpse of their conspiracy into the blinding daylight, and I was going to utterly crush every single person who had built a financial empire on his fake grave. The logistics of infiltrating a fortified, off-the-grid rehabilitation center required a very specific, ruthless kind of precision. The older nurse from the local clinic had taken a massive, potentially fatal risk. During our brief encounter in the sweltering alleyway, she had slipped a crumpled pharmacy receipt into my hand. Written on the back was a single, heavily encrypted messaging handle and a specific time, exactly midnight. She despised the administration of Crestfall Ranch, quietly suspecting for months that they were holding high-value individuals against their will under the guise of severe trauma recovery. She offered me exactly 15 minutes. When the digital clock on my phone shifted to 12, a heavy, unpainted steel utility door at the rear of the disused eastern wing clicked open with a quiet hiss. I left Sienna in the idling rental car, slipping through the shadows cast by the perimeter floodlights. The interior of the building smelled aggressively of industrial bleach and stagnant air. I navigated a dark, narrow corridor until I reached an abandoned hydrotherapy room. The space was dominated by a large, drained tile pool and rusted stainless steel grab bars. Noah was waiting in the darkest corner of the room. There was no cinematic embrace, no tearful, collapsing reunion. The situation was far too volatile, the air far too thin for grand displays of emotion. He was trembling slightly, his jaw tight. He had deliberately skipped his evening dose of heavy chemical sedatives, fighting through the aggressive withdrawal symptoms to maintain a sliver of cognitive clarity for this exact meeting. I stood 3 feet away from him, my heart hammering against my ribs. Maintaining a forced, clinical composure, I needed answers, not comfort. "They did not all die in the valley," Noah whispered, his voice a harsh, damaged rasp. The words echoed off the empty ceramic tiles. The official casualty report was a complete fabrication. The mission did not fail due to enemy contact. It was intentionally compromised from the inside. I pulled a small digital recorder from my pocket, setting it silently on the edge of the drained pool. My mind immediately shifted from that of a grieving wife into the cold, calculating architecture of a crisis investigator. "Tell me exactly what happened before the convoy went down," I instructed, my tone perfectly level. Noah leaned against the damp concrete wall, his eyes darting toward the locked door. "We were running routine supply lines near the border. 2 days before the ambush, I was doing a standard inventory check on the transport manifests. I noticed a glaring discrepancy in container number 4. The official digital logs classified the cargo as standard tactical medical equipment, trauma kits, morphine, field surgical tools, but the weight ratios were entirely wrong. The structural suspension of the transport truck was sitting way too low for bandages and plastic tubing." He paused, swallowing hard, his hands balling into tight fists. "I broke the seal on the container." It was not medical equipment. The crates were packed with high-end, military-grade biometric surveillance components and heavy optical sensors, millions of dollars in restricted hardware. They were using our official military supply runs as a blind shipping lane. They were quietly diverting heavily classified technology directly to a private defense contractor, completely bypassing federal oversight and customs. The puzzle pieces began snapping into place with violent, jagged force. "You found the diverted cargo, and you became a permanent liability." Noah nodded slowly. "I reported the discrepancy to my immediate superior. 36 hours later, our convoy was hit. But it was not a random improvised explosive device. It was a highly surgical strike. The blast completely disabled the lead and rear vehicles, trapping us in the canyon. But the gunfire never came. Instead, a heavily armed extraction team descended on our position. They wore entirely unmarked tactical gear, no patches, no insignias, absolutely zero identifying markers. He looked down at his shaking hands. "They pulled me from the burning wreckage a full 45 minutes before the standard military search and rescue helicopters even left the tarmac. They did not come to save us." They came to execute a pre-planned live witness extraction. They needed me alive, but they needed the world to believe I was burned to ash. The sheer, calculated scale of the operation sent a freezing current straight down my spine. This was not a localized mistake. This was a massive, highly coordinated machine. "Who was waiting for you when you woke up?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Noah closed his eyes, a flicker of raw terror crossing his gaunt face. I woke up strapped to a medical bed in a windowless room. The very first face I saw was Colonel Wesley Harker. The name hit me like a physical punch to the throat. Colonel Wesley Harker was the exact same military liaison officer who had stood in my living room, wearing a pristine dress uniform, solemnly handing me a folded American flag and a bag of fake personal effects. He had orchestrated the death notification while simultaneously holding the man I loved hostage in a desert black site. Harker oversaw the entire conditioning process, Noah continued, his breathing turning ragged. They pumped me full of heavy antipsychotics and dissociative sedatives. They told me I had suffered catastrophic brain trauma. They systematically convinced me that my own memories of the diverted cargo were terrifying hallucinations caused by combat stress. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was how they broke me so I would never try to run. I stepped closer, the space between us charged with an unbearable tension. "What did they tell you about me, Noah?" He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Harker brought me a thick manila folder. He showed me digital banking records, officially notarized settlement papers, and property transfer logs. He told me the military had offered you a massive, multi-million-dollar compensation package to keep the operational failure completely quiet. He showed me your exact digital signature on the non-disclosure agreements. Harker said you took the money, sold our entire life, and relocated to the coast. He told me you knew I was alive, but you chose the payout over me. The cruelty was absolutely staggering. They had not just stolen his freedom, they had weaponized our marriage. They had driven a massive, psychological wedge between us, severing his will to escape by entirely destroying his trust in my love. They built a prison out of a fabricated betrayal, knowing that a man who believes he has nothing to return to will simply stop fighting the chains. "I never signed a single thing," I stated firmly, locking my eyes onto his to ensure the truth anchored deep in his mind. "I never took a dime. I have spent the last 90 days sleeping with the hallway light on, waiting for you to walk through the front door." A shudder ran through his entire body. The heavy, suffocating weight of the lie finally shattered, leaving behind a profound, exhausting relief. But the time for healing had not yet arrived. We were still standing in the middle of a war zone. "Noah, listen to me," I said, checking my watch. We had exactly 4 minutes left before the Internal Security Patrol rounded the eastern wing. They have entirely isolated you here, but they are terrified. They are rapidly trying to liquidate your assets back home to cover their tracks. If Harker is involved, they have a massive financial paper trail to hide. Did you keep any proof of the original cargo manifests before the convoy was hit? Noah's posture straightened. The thick chemical haze in his eyes was rapidly being burned away by returning clarity. "Before I deployed, I knew the internal logistics were dirty," he whispered urgently. "I cloned the entire primary shipping directory, every single manifest, every altered cargo code, every illicit transfer route. I dumped it all onto a heavy, encrypted solid-state data drive." "Where is it?" I demanded. "I hid it under the loose oak floorboards in the storage closet of our cabin in Tennessee. I put it there 3 days before I left the country, just in case something catastrophic went down." The revelation struck me like a bolt of lightning illuminating a pitch-black room, the cabin. Suddenly, every single suffocating interaction with Kent Montrose over the past 3 months made perfect, horrifying sense. Kent had never cared about my emotional closure. His relentless phone calls, his aggressive push to bypass probate, the pre-filled legal documents demanding my signature to transfer the deed. Kent was not trying to help a grieving widow move on. He was desperately trying to gain legal access to the property. He needed to secure the physical location of the leaked data before I accidentally stumbled upon the encrypted drive and blew their entire operation wide open. Kent was not just an annoying, overbearing brother-in-law. He was actively running interference for the people who had buried my husband alive. I reached out and gripped Noah's forearm tightly. His muscles were thin, but the pulse beneath his skin was strong. "I have to leave you here tonight," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "If I try to pull you out of this facility right now, they will lock down the entire state and kill us both on the highway. I need the leverage to crush them permanently." Noah nodded, his expression hardening into the fierce, tactical focus of the soldier I married. "Do not trust anyone in the family. Do not trust the lawyers. Go get the drive." I turned and slipped back through the heavy steel door just as the sweeping beam of the security patrol vehicle rounded the far fence line. I sprinted through the shadows, diving into the passenger seat of the rental car. "Drive," I ordered Sienna. "Get us to the airport." "Where are we going?" she asked, slamming the vehicle into gear and tearing down the dirt access road. "We are flying to Tennessee," I replied, staring out at the unforgiving desert darkness. The deep, agonizing sorrow of a widow had officially been burned away, leaving behind the cold, meticulous wrath of a woman who was about to tear her own family apart. Kent thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess. He was about to find out I was the one holding the board. The red-eye flight from Albuquerque to Knoxville landed just before dawn, dropping us into a heavy, freezing mountain fog. We secured a heavy four-wheel drive rental vehicle at the airport and drove straight into the Great Smoky Mountains. The winding, isolated roads were slick with morning dew, the towering pine trees casting long, imposing shadows across the asphalt. The drive took nearly 3 hours, every single mile heightening the agonizing knot of tension in my stomach. We finally reached the gravel driveway of the remote cabin around 8 o'clock in the morning. The deep surrounding woods were completely silent, but the immediate dread pooling in my chest was deafening. As the vehicle rolled to a stop, I saw it immediately. The heavy, solid oak front door was standing slightly ajar. The massive brass deadbolt had been violently pried from the reinforced doorframe, leaving jagged, pale splinters of wood scattered violently across the woven welcome mat. We stepped out of the vehicle, the cold mountain air biting at my face. I pushed the ruined door open. The interior destruction was absolutely methodical. Whoever had been here was not a desperate local thief looking to pawn a television or a stereo system. They had slashed the heavy fabric upholstery of the sofa, pulled every single book from the built-in mahogany shelves, and violently overturned the heavy dining table. The framed photographs of our wedding had been swept from the mantel, the glass completely shattered across the stone hearth. Kent, he had to be panicking. He realized I was deliberately stalling on signing the property transfer papers, so he sent a private extraction team to tear the place apart. I bypassed the chaotic wreckage in the living room and walked straight down the narrow, dark hallway toward the small utility storage closet near the back of the house. I dropped to my knees on the floor, running my hands over the dusty, rough-hewn floorboards. Noah had always been incredibly meticulous about structural details. I crawled toward the heavy water heater in the corner and found the specific section where the iron nails were purely cosmetic, driven into the wood without actually anchoring to the joists below. I dug my fingernails into the tight seam and pulled upward with all my strength. The heavy plank gave way, resting in the dark. Insulated cavity above the raw dirt foundation was a heavy-duty, moisture-proof polymer bag. I pulled it out, my hands trembling violently. Inside was a compact, solid-state external hard drive. Taped directly to the cold metal casing was a strip of white athletic tape. Written across it in Noah's sharp, unmistakable handwriting was a single, devastating sentence. "If you are reading this, do not trust Kent." We cleared the debris off the heavy kitchen island and set up Sienna's high-performance laptop. I plugged the drive into the port. The screen immediately flashed black, bypassing the standard operating system and demanding a complex decryption key. I typed in the exact string of obscure characters I used to access his personal cloud server back home. The progress bar loaded, and the drive unlocked. The main directory was packed with dozens of massive, heavily encrypted financial ledgers, but sitting at the very top of the folder was a single, high-definition video file simply titled Confession. I clicked it, the trackpad clicking loudly in the silent, ruined cabin. The video showed Noah sitting alone in his dimly lit barracks. Based on the timestamp, he had recorded this exactly 2 days before his final, disastrous deployment. Ashley, if you are watching this, it means I am either dead or completely off the grid, he began, his voice tight and exhausted. He stared directly into the camera lens, looking older and deeply burdened. He explained how his investigation into the altered military cargo manifests had led him down a terrifying rabbit hole. He followed the digital money trail from the private defense contractors straight into a massive corporate shell entity called the Crestfall Recovery Foundation. It was legally registered as a noble nonprofit organization dedicated to the psychological rehabilitation of severely wounded veterans. In reality, Noah explained, Crestfall was a massive, unregulated black hole. It was a perfectly constructed front used to launder untraceable defense budget funds, hide stolen military hardware, and completely erase the existence of operational liabilities. And the primary financial signatory, the man sitting on the board of directors secretly managing the massive influx of dirty capital, was his own brother. Noah detailed a night he visited Kent's luxury penthouse apartment in Chicago shortly before deploying. While Kent was taking a phone call in another room, Noah had accessed Kent's unsecured home network. He found an offshore wire transfer receipt that made his blood run cold. It was a massive movement of capital, nearly $500,000. Siphoned directly from a federal survivor support fund meant entirely for the grieving families of fallen soldiers. The money had been funneled straight into a subsidiary shell company wholly owned by Crestfall. Noah confronted his brother right there in the apartment. Kent panicked immediately, claiming he was just managing a complex investment portfolio for a client and did not know the actual origin of the transferred funds. But Noah knew the absolute truth. Kent was not an innocent financial manager. He was the primary architect of the entire shadow operation. I stood in the destroyed kitchen, the cold mountain air completely knocked from my lungs. Kent Montrose was not merely a pawn caught in a military cover-up. Kent was the only living blood relative Noah had left in the world. He was the man who had stood in my kitchen and poured my coffee with trembling hands. He was the man who had hugged me so tightly at the memorial service, shedding real, tangible tears onto my black dress while he gently urged me to let go of the pain. Every single act of profound comfort, every text message asking how I was sleeping, every offer to help with the heavy paperwork was a highly calculated maneuver. He was closely monitoring my mental state, ensuring I remained a compliant, deeply broken widow who would quickly sign away the exact property where the evidence of his treason was buried. Sienna's fingers flew across the keyboard, opening the complex financial spreadsheets attached to the video file. "Look at this routing data right here," she said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. She traced a series of recent, highly obfuscated transactions flagged under the massive Crestfall corporate umbrella. She isolated a newly established high-yield bridge fund. The primary account holder was listed under my exact legal name. "The account was opened using your secure digital signature," Sienna explained, highlighting the authorization codes. "The exact same electronic authorization protocol you gave Marissa to handle your estate and life insurance payouts. Trace the inbound funds," I commanded, my voice turning into a flat, unrecognizable monotone. Sienna ran a decryption script on the ledger. The money from Noah's military life insurance and the federal death gratuity did not get delayed by the bureaucracy. It was fully paid out by the government exactly 12 days after the official casualty report was filed, but it never hit your personal bank account. Marissa used your digital power of attorney to intercept the deposit and route the entire sum directly into this bridge fund. And the sole, binding beneficiary of this fund, programmed to trigger an automatic, untraceable offshore transfer after 90 days, is a holding company registered directly to Kent Montrose. The solid wooden floor beneath my feet suddenly felt entirely unstable. While I was lying on the living room rug back in Virginia, physically suffocating under the catastrophic weight of my grief, My oldest friend and my brother-in-law were sitting in air-conditioned offices, using my tragedy as a highly lucrative financial instrument. Marissa had flawlessly played the role of the fiercely protective, loyal lawyer. She had hugged me, brought me expensive takeout food, and assured me she was handling the bureaucratic nightmare completely pro bono. In reality, she was actively draining my authorized survivor benefits to directly finance the very foundation that was currently keeping my husband locked in a desert cage. They used my digital signature, my paralyzing trauma, and my absolute blind trust to financially legitimize a fake casualty report and line their own pockets with the blood money. The profound, agonizing pain of losing my husband evaporated into the freezing cabin air. The shock of the double betrayal burned away in a fraction of a second. What rushed in to fill the massive void in my chest was a cold, absolute, and terrifying rage. It was the specific, dangerous kind of fury that entirely stops your tears, lowers your heart rate, and meticulously focuses your mind into a razor-sharp weapon. I was no longer a tragic victim caught in the crossfire of a military mistake. I was the primary target of a massive, coordinated financial assassination, and the people holding the weapons were the ones sitting at my own dinner table. I reached out and gently closed the laptop screen. "Copy everything," I ordered Sienna, my tone leaving absolutely no room for hesitation. "Clone the entire drive. I want every ledger, every routing number, every hidden shell company, and Noah's recorded confession copied onto 3 separate, heavily encrypted external flash drives. Then upload a 4th copy to the secure, decentralized offshore server you use for your corporate clients." While Sienna initiated the massive data transfer, I reached into my leather bag and pulled out the plain black notebook I had started back in Virginia. I opened to the 2nd page. My hand was completely steady, devoid of the violent tremors that had plagued me for 3 months. The dark ink flowed perfectly smooth against the white paper as I wrote down the exact architecture of my vengeance. Colonel Wesley Harker, Kent Montrose, Marissa Cade, Crestfall Recovery Foundation. I stared at the 4 names, etching them permanently into the forefront of my mind. I closed the heavy cover of the notebook. The time for hiding, mourning, and asking polite questions was officially over. I was going to burn their entire empire to the ground, and I was going to use their own matches to light the fire. I sat at the glass dining table in the loft, the encrypted hard drives lined up like heavy ammunition. The profound, suffocating fog of morning had completely lifted from my brain. In its place was the cold, sterile clarity of a seasoned crisis architect. I had spent over a decade burying corporate scandals, neutralizing whistleblowers, and spinning horrific disasters into acceptable public relations narratives. I knew exactly how to dismantle a reputation because I had spent my entire career building them out of thin air. Now, I was going to use every single ruthless tactic I knew to annihilate the people who had tried to bury me. To win a war of this magnitude, the enemy must remain entirely convinced that they hold absolute power. I needed Kent and Marissa to believe their psychological manipulation was still flawlessly executing. They needed a broken, exhausted widow, so I gave them an Oscar-worthy performance. I initiated the first strike on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I sat on the edge of the sofa, holding the phone to my ear while Sienna monitored the digital recording interface on her laptop. I dialed Marissa. When she answered, her voice was draped in that familiar, sickeningly sweet layer of practiced empathy. I forced my breathing to sound shallow and erratic. I let my voice crack perfectly at the edges. "Marissa, I cannot do this anymore," I whispered, staring dead ahead at the blank wall. "The house is too quiet. Kent keeps pushing about the mountain property, and I think he is right. Holding on to it is just dragging out the agony. I am so tired. I just want to sign the transfer papers and be done with the entire estate." I could practically hear the triumphant smile spreading across her face through the cellular connection. She thought the finish line was finally crossed. "Oh, honey, I know it is agonizing," Marissa cooed smoothly, "but you are making the absolute right choice for your healing journey. It is for the best. Plus, with the new recovery assessment protocols coming up at Crestfall, Kent really needs the capital freed up to manage things. The sentence died in her throat. A heavy, suffocating silence slammed into the phone line. She had slipped. The sheer arrogance of her perceived victory had made her careless. She had explicitly mentioned a recovery assessment at a supposedly obscure veteran charity. She knew the internal operational language of the exact black site prison currently holding my husband. She realized her massive error the exact second the words left her mouth. "I mean, the new charity financial assessments?" Marissa stammered, her voice suddenly tight and noticeably an octave higher. "The board reviews. Kent has to manage the trust overhead." "Of course," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly weak and oblivious. "Just send the documents over. I will sign whatever you need." I disconnected the call. Sienna and I locked eyes across the room. We had her on high-definition audio. The betrayal was no longer just a theory buried in a hidden ledger. It was spoken aloud. But I knew one compromised lawyer and one greedy brother-in-law did not possess the sheer power required to orchestrate a fake military extraction. A machine this large, requiring unmarked tactical teams and falsified federal casualty reports, had to be systemic. They were operating a highly profitable business model, and a business model requires volume. It required more than one fake grave. I utilized the secure, untraceable research nodes I maintained for international corporate espionage clients. I quietly pulled the heavily redacted unit casualty lists from the past 36 months. I looked for anomalies. I looked for closed caskets, sudden operational failures, and men who had no surviving family members other than a single, easily manipulated spouse. I found two specific names. Using encrypted communication channels, I reached out to the two surviving wives. I did not introduce myself with wild conspiracy theories. I simply asked them if the military liaisons had pushed them to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding the exact circumstances of their husbands' deaths. We arranged a highly secure virtual meeting. The stories they told me over the encrypted video feed were a flawless, terrifying mirror of my own nightmare. The initial notifications were impeccably clean and perfectly rehearsed. The caskets were permanently sealed due to catastrophic, unidentifiable trauma. The survivor benefits and life insurance payouts were bizarrely delayed, only to be heavily managed by newly introduced financial advisors who strongly recommended funneling the capital into specialized bridge trusts. The pressure to stay silent, to accept the tragedy, and to move on was absolute and relentless. We were not simply a collection of grieving widows. We were the primary funding mechanism for a shadow operation. They were systematically using the chaos of classified military records and private defense contractors to disappear liabilities, while simultaneously siphoning our legal survivor benefits to fund the very black sites holding the men we loved. The final piece of the devastating puzzle arrived via a burner device. The brave older nurse from the desert clinic had kept her promise. Every 48 hours, she risked everything to facilitate a brief, heavily encrypted text exchange with Noah. Knowing that I had never betrayed him, knowing that the agonizing narrative forced into his head was a complete fabrication, had triggered a massive shift in his cognitive state. He was aggressively fighting the heavy sedatives. His memory was rapidly returning in sharp, lucid fragments. Late one evening, the burner phone vibrated. Noah sent a message detailing a conversation he had feigned sleep to overhear. Colonel Wesley Harker had been standing in the hallway outside Noah's locked room, speaking directly to the facility administrator. "Keep his dosage high," Harker had ordered. "Just let their families believe they were heavily compensated, and the survivor money stays locked in the foundation shell accounts. It is clean, untraceable capital." That single sentence stripped away the final layer of mystery. It was the undeniable proof of motive. I spent the next 14 days transforming Sienna's downtown loft into a fortified war room. I was no longer a civilian. I was the director of a hostile corporate takeover. I used every single ounce of my professional expertise to construct a master destruction dossier. I called it the kill file. In my line of work, you never hand investigators a messy, chaotic pile of circumstantial evidence. You hand them a fully weaponized, irrefutable narrative wrapped in a bow. I mapped out the entire timeline on digital storyboards. I synced the drone footage of Noah with the falsified casualty reports. I integrated Noah's video confession from the mountain cabin alongside the offshore routing numbers Sienna had meticulously traced. I included the verified audio recording of Marissa slipping up on the phone, the sworn testimonies from the other two military widows, and the exact digital footprints linking Harker to the Crestfall holding companies. I translated their complex, highly insulated financial crimes into devastating, easily digestible bullet points designed specifically to hand-feed federal prosecutors and investigative journalists. Sienna asked me why we did not just upload the entire file to the Department of Justice immediately. She wanted to send the tactical teams to the desert that very night, but I refused. Sending the file to a faceless federal agency meant the gears of justice would grind slowly behind closed doors. Men like Kent and Harker possessed the financial resources to hire armies of elite defense attorneys. They knew exactly how to operate in the shadows, how to stall indictments, and how to quietly plea bargain their way into minimum security resorts while keeping their reputations relatively intact. I was not going to allow them to negotiate their survival in a quiet boardroom. I wanted them to feel the exact same blinding, suffocating helplessness they had mercilessly forced upon me. I wanted their absolute destruction to be profoundly public, legally inescapable, and utterly humiliating. I needed them to remain perfectly confident. I needed them to believe they had won the game. I wanted them to stand on a beautifully lit stage, basking in their fake righteousness and their stolen wealth, right before I reached out and violently ripped the floor out from beneath their feet. I was no longer searching for the truth just to heal my own broken heart. I was engineering an execution, and I was going to make sure the entire world watched them bleed. The counterattack did not begin with a gunshot. It began with a man in a cheap gray suit knocking on my front door. Exactly 48 hours after I returned from the mountain cabin, a process server handed me a massive, heavy stack of civil litigation documents. Kent was officially suing me. The aggressive lawsuit demanded the immediate, forced transfer of the Tennessee property, citing an electronic agreement he swore I had legally authorized. He was actively using the fraudulent digital signature Marissa had forged to force my hand through the local legal system. To stall the aggressive injunction, I had to file an immediate dispute claiming digital identity theft. It was a massive, highly calculated risk. It forced me to reveal a tiny fraction of my hand, effectively letting them know I was no longer a compliant, oblivious widow. I was officially challenging their perfectly curated paperwork. The very next morning, a bonded courier delivered a thick, terrifying envelope from a prestigious defense law firm based in Washington. It was a direct warning from Colonel Wesley Harker. The legal threat was exceptionally clear and aggressively hostile. It formally accused me of attempting to unlawfully access highly classified, restricted military personnel files and sensitive national security assets. Harker was deploying the massive, terrifying weight of the federal government to crush me. He was deliberately attempting to invert the narrative, painting himself as the noble protector of military secrets while framing me as a rogue, unstable civilian committing severe federal felonies. Then came the social assassination. My phone began vibrating incessantly with excessively gentle, deeply pitying messages from mutual acquaintances and former corporate colleagues. Marissa had weaponized her extensive social network against me. She was aggressively circulating a whispered, tragic narrative that I was suffering from a severe, prolonged psychotic break. She told everyone who would listen that my grief had completely mutated into a paranoid delusion, that I simply could not accept the finality of my husband's death, and that I was hallucinating massive government conspiracies just to cope with the trauma. A former coworker even texted me a link to a grief counselor. It was a flawlessly executed, classic dirty public relations tactic. Discredit the whistleblower completely before the whistle is ever blown. I had authored that exact same strategy for corporate clients a dozen times in my career. Watching it deployed against my own sanity was incredibly suffocating, but it confirmed one absolute, beautiful truth. They were completely terrified. The psychological warfare quickly escalated into blatant physical intimidation. Sienna burst into the loft late on a Tuesday night, her face chalk white and her breathing jagged. Someone had completely shattered the windshield of her parked vehicle. The intruder had violently ripped the hardwired dashboard camera straight out of the center console, leaving bare wires hanging over the dashboard. Exactly 10 minutes later, her primary encrypted email server triggered a massive intrusion alert. They were systematically hunting for our digital footprint in the dark. They were no longer comfortably acting out a rehearsed script. They were actively panicking, desperately trying to locate and destroy the copied data drive before I could weaponize it against them. The sheer, palpable panic on their end only motivated us to dig aggressively deeper into the financial ledgers. While analyzing the complex web of offshore shell corporations, Sienna uncovered a newly registered commercial loan document that made my blood run completely cold. Exactly 3 days after the military officers stood on my porch and delivered the fabricated casualty report, Kent had secured a massive loan for several $1 million to drastically expand the Crestfall Holding Company. The physical collateral he used to guarantee that massive influx of dirty capital was the primary Montrose family inheritance estate. Kent had literally used the fabricated death of his own younger brother as immediate, highly lucrative financial leverage. Noah's fake grave served as the direct down payment for Kent's booming shadow empire. The absolute depravity of his betrayal was staggering. Amidst the suffocating, relentless pressure, a lifeline arrived via a heavily secured digital drop from the New Mexico clinic. The brave older nurse had risked her entire career and freedom to send me a legally notarized affidavit. In the sworn legal document, she explicitly detailed how Noah had repeatedly desperately begged the facility administrators to let him call his wife. She meticulously documented the exact dates and times the private security contractors had physically restrained him, forcibly injecting him with heavy chemical sedatives to silence his constant requests. The affidavit was the final, undeniable nail in the coffin of their lies. It completely destroyed Harker's fabricated narrative that Noah had willingly abandoned his marriage and chosen to disappear into the desert. My husband had fought violently for me every single day in that cage, but the most earth-shattering twist arrived precisely at midnight on a Friday. The specialized, highly encrypted communication channel Noah had hidden within the solid-state drive suddenly pinged with an incoming connection request. Sienna and I stared at the flashing green icon on the screen, the air in the loft turning to absolute ice. Only one other person on the entire planet was supposed to possess the complex decryption key for that specific military frequency. I reached out and accepted the connection. A heavily distorted voice crackled sharply through the laptop speakers. "Ashley, do not speak. Just listen." I recognized the deep, gravelly cadence immediately. It belonged to Milo Grant. He was Noah's tactical team leader, the exact man the military claimed had burned to ash inside the lead vehicle during the canyon ambush. "Milo!" I gasped, the word tearing violently out of my throat. "They told me you were dead." "I am completely dead on paper," Milo replied, his voice echoing from a secure, untraceable location somewhere deep in the Colorado mountains. I managed to evade the rogue extraction team in the valley by dropping into the river. I have been moving entirely off the grid for exactly 3 months, waiting in the shadows to see who was actually pulling the strings before I made a move. I saw the digital tripwires you triggered in the restricted military database this week. You are kicking up a massive storm. "I have the financial ledgers," I told him, my voice shaking with pure adrenaline. "I know everything about the diverted cargo. Noah is alive. They are holding him captive at a black site in New Mexico." A heavy, jagged silence fell over the encrypted line. "I knew the cargo was dirty," Milo finally said, his tone hardening into steel. "But I have something infinitely better than complex financial ledgers." When the ambush hit, I physically pulled the original, unaltered digital transport log straight from the burning tactical vehicle. I have the exact serial numbers of the restricted surveillance hardware. I have the real destination coordinates, and most importantly, I have the digital authorization signatures of every single commanding officer who officially signed off on the blind run. I can definitively prove the mission was intentionally sabotaged to cover a massive, illegal financial pipeline. It was never a tragic battlefield accident. It was a highly coordinated corporate assassination. The connection terminated, leaving me staring intensely at the blank computer screen. The entire battlefield had dramatically shifted beneath our feet. The enemy was rapidly tightening the noose around my neck, ruthlessly deploying lawsuits, federal legal threats, public humiliation, and violent physical intimidation, but they were entirely blind to their own fatal flaw. Every single time they squeezed harder to crush me, they accidentally ripped another mask off their own faces, exposing the rotting, putrid core of their massive conspiracy. They thought they were aggressively backing a helpless, delusional widow into a dark corner. They did not realize they were simply handing me the exact weapons I needed to slaughter them all. My name was announced over the massive speaker system, the deep voice of the master of ceremonies echoing through the grand ballroom. The soft jazz music faded into respectful silence. Polite, sympathetic applause rippled across the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. The Crestfall Recovery Foundation's annual Memorial Gala was in full swing in the heart of the Washington metropolitan area. The stated purpose of this extravagant evening was to honor the ultimate sacrifices of our fallen heroes. In reality, it was a sickening, beautifully disguised masquerade designed to extract millions of dollars from wealthy political donors and private defense contractors. Exactly 2 weeks prior, Kent had extended the invitation. His tone had been perfectly measured, blending false brotherly affection with the subtle, lingering threat of the ongoing civil litigation regarding our mountain property. He asked me to be the keynote speaker. He wanted the grieving widow of Noah Montrose to stand under the crystal chandeliers and publicly endorse the foundation that was secretly holding her husband hostage in a desert cage. I accepted his invitation without a single second of hesitation. My immediate compliance sent a massive wave of relief through their entire operation. Kent and Marissa completely believed their relentless pressure campaign had successfully broken my spirit. They thought the shattered windshield, the terrifying federal legal warnings from Colonel Harker, and the vicious social smear tactics had finally forced me into absolute submission. They believed I was exhausted, terrified of losing my home, and desperate to return to the quiet, obedient role of the tragic victim they so desperately needed me to play. In truth, I was using their arrogant invitation as the ultimate Trojan horse. They were willingly handing me a live microphone and a captive audience comprised of their biggest financial backers, local press syndicates, powerful defense attorneys, and elite military brass. I was going to use the exact stage they built for their own glorification to completely annihilate them. Sienna had spent 72 consecutive hours locked in her downtown loft, constructing an impenetrable, multi-layered digital guillotine. She was not just compiling a simple presentation. She was engineering a full hostile takeover of the hotel ballroom's master audiovisual system. She meticulously linked the original high-definition drone video from the New Mexico compound to the heavily redacted military transport logs. She layered the complex offshore wire transfers over the sworn notarized affidavit from the courageous desert clinic nurse. She anchored the entire presentation with the devastating video confession Noah had recorded in the hidden cabin. Sienna built a massive, undeniable digital web, connecting the Crestfall shell funds directly to Kent and Colonel Wesley Harker, formatting the hard evidence into a flawless, inescapable visual narrative. Milo had agreed to testify via a secure, live-streamed, encrypted connection during the event, but the rogue tactical leader demanded a strict, non-negotiable insurance policy. He knew that the exact second the evidence hit the projection screens, the powerful men in that room would deploy every single legal and physical resource they possessed to black out the building and sever the connections. Milo required me to establish a simultaneous, automated data dump. I had to guarantee that the absolute second I began my speech, our master kill file would be electronically distributed to the Department of Justice, 3 independent federal oversight committees, and 5 major investigative journalists. We were permanently destroying their ability to quietly bury the scandal behind closed doors. The most dangerous variable of the entire night was Noah himself. Through the immense, risking efforts of the older nurse, we had managed to coordinate a blind transport, smuggling him out of the remote facility during a chaotic shift change exactly 48 hours prior. He was physically weak, exhausted, and still fighting the lingering effects of the heavy sedatives, but his mind was sharp and his resolve was absolute. He agreed to step out of the shadows and appear publicly at the gala. We both knew the severe, irreversible consequences of this decision. Walking into that ballroom meant entirely surrendering any chance of disappearing into a quiet, peaceful life. It meant triggering a massive, exhausting federal investigation and throwing ourselves directly into a media firestorm. But Noah looked at me in the dimly lit hotel room we had secured, just blocks from the venue, his hand gripping mine tightly. He chose the blinding truth because he knew I had endured far too much pain on my own. He completely refused to let me stand on that stage alone. An hour before the gala officially commenced, I sat in the luxurious, private green room located just behind the main stage. The air was thick with the scent of fresh lilies and expensive cosmetics. The heavy oak door swung open, and Marissa glided into the room. She was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald silk gown, looking every inch the successful, compassionate legal advocate she pretended to be. Her smile was incredibly warm, but her eyes held the cold, calculating gleam of a predator admiring a captured prize. "You look absolutely beautiful, Ashley," Marissa cooed, stepping forward and placing a gentle, perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder. "I am so incredibly proud of you. I know the past few months have been a terrifying, confusing storm, but stepping up tonight is exactly how you honor his legacy. It is the final step in your healing process." She reached into her expensive designer clutch and pulled out 3 pages of thick, heavy stock paper. "I took the liberty of drafting your speech for tonight," Marissa said, her tone dripping with fake humility. "I know how overwhelming public speaking can be, especially when the emotions are still so raw. I made sure to highlight how the Crestfall Foundation has served as a guiding angel for military families like yours during their darkest hours. You just need to read the words, and the entire room will support you." I looked down at the perfectly typed, deeply hypocritical words. The speech was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, designed entirely to validate their massive money laundering operation using my manufactured grief as an impenetrable shield. I felt a cold, dark thrill ripple through my veins. "Thank you, Marissa," I replied, forcing a soft, grateful smile onto my face. "You have no idea how much this means to me. You have always known exactly what to say." I took the heavy paper from her hands. I folded it carefully and slid it directly into my own purse. I did not throw it away. I kept it as a tangible, physical souvenir for the exact moment I was about to tear their pristine, moralistic masks to shreds. Marissa gave my shoulder one final, condescending squeeze and left the room to join the wealthy donors in the main hall. I stood up and walked toward the heavy velvet curtains separating the backstage area from the ballroom. The extravagant gala was officially opening. I could hear the soft, sophisticated notes of a live jazz quartet drifting through the air. The gentle, rhythmic clinking of fine crystal champagne flutes echoed against the soaring, gold-leafed ceilings. The room was packed with hundreds of powerful politicians, elite military contractors, and high society philanthropists, all exchanging firm handshakes and patting themselves on the back for their incredible generosity. The ambient lighting was cast in a warm, luxurious auburn hue, entirely hiding the dark, putrid foundation of stolen blood money the entire event was built upon. Kent was out there, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, smiling broadly for the local press photographers. Colonel Harker was out there, wearing his immaculate dress uniform adorned with unearned medals, sipping expensive scotch. Marissa was out there, securing her position among the political elite. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived invincibility. None of the powerful, wealthy individuals standing in that magnificent room had the slightest inclination that the quiet, broken widow they had invited to legitimize their crimes was not there to mourn. They had absolutely no idea that the soft music and the clinking glasses were merely the calm before a catastrophic storm. They were about to witness a grieving woman lock the doors, seize the microphone, and turn an elegant, high society memorial service into a brutal, unforgiving, and entirely public execution. I smoothed the fabric of my dark dress, took a deep breath of the perfume-scented air, and waited to step into the blinding lights. I walked up the carpeted steps to the grand stage, my heels sinking slightly into the plush fabric. The spotlight hit my face, blinding and hot. A hush fell over the massive ballroom. Hundreds of expectant faces turned upward, waiting to consume the tragic, inspiring story of a broken widow. I adjusted the microphone. When I spoke, my voice was a fragile, trembling whisper, perfectly matching the exact persona they had meticulously constructed for me over the past 90 days. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, letting a calculated tear shine in my eye. Losing my husband, Noah, was a darkness I never thought I would survive. The condolences, the standard military procedures, the endless stacks of legal paperwork, it completely shattered my world. I paused, looking directly at the front table where Kent, Marissa, and Colonel Harker were sitting. They were beaming with arrogant pride. They thought they had won. My fragile posture vanished. I stood up perfectly straight. My voice dropped its tremble and hardened into a sharp, echoing, absolute command. But I quickly learned that my profound grief was not a tragedy to the people in this room. It was a highly profitable business model. The smiles at the front table instantly froze. A confused murmur rippled through the elegant crowd. "I am not going to read the heartwarming speech my lawyer, Marissa Cade, wrote for me," I stated loudly, my voice echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling. "Instead, I'm going to show you exactly how the Crestfall Recovery Foundation turns the fake ashes of American soldiers into untraceable offshore millions." I gave a subtle nod toward the back of the room. Up in the audiovisual booth, Sienna executed the command. The massive, high-definition projection screens flanking the stage violently flickered to life. There was no logo. There was no charity branding. There was only the harsh, blinding desert sun of New Mexico. The drone footage filled the room, zooming in sharply on the shaded porch. Audible gasps erupted from the audience as they saw a gaunt, bearded man sitting in a wheelchair, bearing Noah's exact facial scar. Before the room could process the visual shock, the screen split. Noah's self-recorded video from the mountain cabin began playing, his exhausted voice detailing the massive money laundering scheme. Beside his face, Sienna projected the irrefutable financial ledgers. She highlighted the bridge funds, the massive commercial loan Kent had secured, using a dead man's estate as collateral, and the exact timestamps showing Noah's secure digital files being accessed and deleted 4 days after his supposed death. The notarized affidavit from the courageous clinic nurse flashed across the screen in bold red text, legally swearing that the facility was forcibly drugging a captive soldier. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Elite donors were standing up, shouting in confusion and horror. "But this foundation did not act alone," I continued, projecting my voice over the rising panic. I delivered the heaviest, most fatal blow of the night. "They required the complicity of the military to supply the bodies." The screens shifted one final time, displaying the classified, heavily encrypted military transport logs provided by Milo Grant. "This is the original, unaltered logistics manifest from the day my husband was supposedly killed in action," I declared, pointing sharply at the glaring data. The mission was entirely fabricated. It was twisted to cover the illegal, off-the-books transfer of highly restricted surveillance technology to private defense contractors. They authorized a strike on their own men, and then systematically erased 2 living soldiers from the federal system to permanently cover their financial tracks. Kent leaped out of his chair, his face entirely purple with rage. He rushed the edge of the stage, screaming frantically at the security guards to cut the main power, to kill the microphones, to grab me. Harker was furiously dialing his phone, his pristine military composure completely shattered. Marissa was frozen in her chair, her face drained of all blood, looking like a ghost. But Kent never made it up the stairs. At that exact second, the heavy, towering oak doors at the absolute rear of the ballroom violently swung open, crashing loudly against the mahogany walls. The entire room spun around. The security guards froze. Kent stopped dead in his tracks. The shouting completely died in the throats of every single politician and billionaire present. Noah walked into the room. He was alive. He was wearing a simple dark suit that hung loosely on his drastically thinned frame. His left shoulder was visibly stiff and angled poorly, a permanent testament to the physical trauma he had endured. But his steps were deliberate, heavy, and undeniable. He was not a ghost. He was real, breathing flesh and blood, walking directly down the center aisle of their extravagant gala, completely crushing the entire fabricated narrative Crestfall had built its empire upon. The silence in the room was deafening, suffocating, and absolute. He stopped a few feet away from the head table. He looked down at his older brother, then at the terrified lawyer, and finally at the disgraced colonel. Noah did not scream. He did not throw a punch. He simply looked at them with profound, hollow disgust and spoke one short, devastating sentence that echoed through the dead silent ballroom. I tried to call my wife. They did not let me come home. That single sentence was the executioner's blade falling. Simultaneously, the side doors of the ballroom opened. Dozens of men and women wearing dark suits and federal windbreakers flooded the floor. I had not trusted the local authorities. I had coordinated directly with an independent coalition of federal financial investigators and a ruthless team of independent prosecutors. They entered the room that very night, seizing physical assets and serving immediate, non-negotiable subpoenas before anyone could shred a single document or spin a public relations lie. Kent was physically blocked from leaving the room, immediately read his rights, and pulled into a massive federal investigation for severe wire fraud, international money laundering, and the malicious embezzlement of federal survivor funds. Marissa sat trembling at her table, facing the immediate, permanent loss of her legal license and severe criminal charges for digital forgery, massive conflicts of interest, and the gross, malicious deception of a vulnerable client. Colonel Wesley Harker was publicly stripped of his command insignia on the spot, suspended without pay, and dragged into the absolute center of both a military tribunal and a sprawling civil investigation. I walked down the steps of the stage. I did not run into Noah's arms for a dramatic, cinematic embrace while the crowd clapped. This was not a fairy tale. I stood beside my husband, looked directly at the crowd of wealthy donors who had blindly funded our torture, and delivered my final message. The most disgusting, unforgivable thing in this world is not the brutality of war, I said, my voice steady and cold. It is the people standing safely on the home front who learn how to package, trade, and profit from our devastating loss. We walked out of that hotel ballroom together, leaving the architects of our misery trapped in the blinding flash of press cameras and federal handcuffs. In the end, I did not sign a single non-disclosure agreement. I kept the mountain cabin in Tennessee, refusing to yield a single inch of our life to their greed. With Sienna's relentless help, Noah and I began building a genuinely transparent, fully audited recovery fund designed to actually support the surviving veterans those corrupt institutions had discarded. Our marriage was not magically healed overnight. The trauma of his captivity and the agonizing months of my fabricated mourning left deep, jagged scars that required intense, painful work to overcome. But the absolute truth had finally returned to our home. Justice was a slow, grinding wheel, but it was finally turning in our favor. My revenge was entirely successful, and I did not have to fire a single bullet or take a single life. I simply exposed the terrifying truth, walked away, and forced every single one of those monsters to live out the rest of their miserable days choking on the absolute ruins of the empire they had tried to build on my husband's grave. Thank you so much for listening to this story with me today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know exactly where in the world you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.